Thank, thank you, Vincenzo. Good morning, everybody. Let's get started. We have quite a lot of materials to go through. So, as I was introduced, my name is Zdenek. Okay, and this is not working. And this is not working either. Oh, very good. Okay. So, my name is Zdenek. I'm also known as Z from the times when I've been with a company called API. Many of you might know the company. It has been, or it still is, an API design platform. I've been with the company from almost the start, and yeah, we were coining some terms like API design, API first. This was a platform to help everybody designing the APIs. The company was successful. It was acquired by Oracle almost 3 years ago, and that's also the time when I left the company. I started GoodApi consulting, independent consulting, because I've seen people in the need coming to API in the need for assistance with their APIs, and instead they usually ended up buying the software. So I've been blessed to work with some really big companies and really interesting companies and small startups, also with my friends from Adidas who were speaking here yesterday. And I've been joined with 2 other partners, Adam and Eric, whom you might also know from the API space. Now, today I want to talk about one thing, because I don't think we talk enough about this topic at all, actually. It's the API product ownership and the role of an API product owner or API product manager. Is there anybody here who acts as an API product owner in this audience? There are a few. I know there is. Yes, OK, very good. So, to start even talk about the API product ownership, we need to go a little bit back and talk about the API first. And this goes all the way back to 15 years ago, to legendary Jeff Bezos' mandate, when he basically asked everybody in his company, in Amazon at that time, to provide all the capabilities via interfaces, via APIs. And he ended up the memo saying that everybody who will not follow that will be fired, right? The consequence of having this mandate in place is basically this API first. He mandated that everybody in the company offers the company capabilities via the interface. He didn't care at the time that much about what will be the interface, what language, what API style, but that was essentially the inception of this API first approach, where every product, everything you do in your company has an API. This gives you more freedom, but also brings a lot of responsibility. There are some common pitfalls with approaches like API first. On one hand, people often think, or organization thinks, hey, set the vision, we'll do API first. Well, that alone is not enough. Likewise, it's not enough if you just restructure the IT. If you restructure the IT and you think that API first will happen, that's not going to happen. There are 3 pillars of the API first: the business, organization, and technology. You need to have your business understanding that everything that your company and organization is providing is happening through these APIs. They need to have some understanding of what an API is, and that is the connective fabric of everything in your organization. Which brings me to the organizational part, where the whole organization and everybody in the organization must understand that APIs are actually the main deliverables within the organization. And finally, the technology. APIs were and are about the technology, but they should not be about the technology only. It's not only about the particular API styles, it's not about cool microservices or deployment methods. It's really just a vessel helping you to deliver the business capabilities. The main takeaway here is that the APIs are no longer just about the technology. And we'll get more into this. Going back to the presentation yesterday, when my friends from Adidas were talking about their journey, I'll give you an example of API first, illustrated on Adidas. I said that everything produced by this company has an API. And Adidas is very successful in doing so, because you might be thinking, wait, it's a sports company, right? Probably one of the best or biggest in the world. They are doing great sports product. How does this relate to what you are saying, like this API first? Well, guess what? In Adidas, everything has an API. Every single product has an API. The shoe I'm wearing right now, it has an API in the sense that you can find the product information on it. So there is a product API. There is an availability API where you can check out, where the shoe is, if you can buy it somewhere. There is, of course, the order API. There is an e-commerce API. There's a lot of APIs related just to shoes or other apparel, right? So everything really at Adidas is driven by the APIs. All the business is happening through the APIs. All right, so speaking of the API product, you can take two approaches, or talking about the API Academy, you can start to think about API product in two ways. One is API as a product. That's very straightforward. The API being your product, it's something you sell, you monetize directly the use of the API. You have some interesting data, you might be selling them, you are charging for the access, you are charging for the use of your API directly. That might be an example, for example, of a sports radar, which is a company that offers the sports results via API. They charge you directly for the access. The other one, we call it product as API, is indirect monetization. You are not really charging directly for use of your API. You have these APIs as a sort of interface to your product, to your company capabilities. And this is a little bit more concrete, but it still makes so much sense. And actually, it's the powerhouse of an API economy. You can increase the stickiness with these APIs of your products. That's, for example, Dropbox. Dropbox application on your phone is enabled through the API. It doesn't make money directly to Dropbox, but it helps you, to have a Dropbox wherever you go. That increases the stickiness with the product. It, of course, enables innovation, but maybe most importantly, it enables leveraging partner sales channels. Meaning that if somebody is integrating with your API, that company or organization or person is effectively becoming your sales force. Because they are selling something with their sales force that integrates with you. They are basically expanding and scaling up your sales force. OK, going next, product hierarchy. When you think about the API product, you need to start thinking about service first. So service is a concept in this definition that provides some capabilities, that provide some business value of your company. On top of a service, you might have or you should have this API, which is basically a representation of your service. So you have your capabilities provided by service, and API is an interface to these capabilities. It is a representation of those. On top of it, you might or you might not have a UI, and that's not only the, let's say, a page or mobile application. It might be SDK, it might be CLI. That also might be part of what you think of as an API product. We are getting in a situation when the products are not living alone. In most applications, in most organizations, you have more than one API being consumed or being exposed. And these APIs are forming landscapes. They are forming landscapes on the domain level. They are forming landscapes on organizational level. And within the organizational level, you might think about these hierarchies, having some backend APIs interfacing to your backend services, databases, third-party vendors, whatnot. Core APIs, those are the meat of your business. This is where your capabilities are being created or exposed. And then on top of it, you might have an experience layer. Those are APIs, let's say, to make it easier for e-commerce or mobile applications to consume your capabilities. Now, the API products are spanning all these layers. And, of course, one API product might be dependent on other APIs product. This is why it's important to start thinking about the consistency between the API and APIs products. You are now looking at what I think of a maturity of an API product in the terms of consistency. Similarly to, let's say, car manufacturers, they have a portfolio of products. They have cars that complement each other, and they are together giving a full story and maybe serving a full market. And we really want to look at API products in an API landscape as a consistent offering. This is a win-win scenario for both providers and consumers, because for providers, it's, of course, cheaper, faster, easier to deliver new products. For consumers, it's easier to move between the products. It's easier to consume different APIs from the same vendor. All right, so that was a product itself and the product landscapes. Now let's talk about the lifecycle. We've seen a lot of lifecycle pictures here today, yesterday. This is a product management science. This is a well-explored territory. There is a lot of books. These are examples of some of the product lifecycle in the classical sense of a product. I picked this one. This is my take on one lifecycle, or the first lifecycle that I want to present to you, and that's a market lifecycle. That's how your API product is doing on the market. So there's a timeline from the inception to when you eventually retire your API. And at the inception of your API product, of course, it's a negative impact for your business. It costs you, your business or you money and time to develop the product. As you are moving on, you are hopefully bringing some value to your company, right? That's why you need to think about the APIs as well as products. You need to think about, okay, what values are the APIs bringing? So hopefully you will break eventually even, and then you get to this plateau of productivity, to this maturity of API product. Now, if you are a product owner, you of course might want to try to prolong the purple line or even ramp up the usage, and of course improve the business impact by a product owner's work. So, adding new features, improving the usability, identifying the points that might be there, blocking the usage and growth of your API. In addition to this market lifecycle, there is a good old software development lifecycle. So this one was an example taken from our friend's book, Continuous API Management. You move from creation, publication, realization of the values being published, to maintenance and updating, and you iterate until your product declines and you eventually retire it. One thing I want to stress here is the design first. I'm not going to go through all the points of the life cycle, but probably one of the most important is this design first approach. If you are really serious with your API product, you should treat it as any physical product. And that means you prototype it first. You design it first, you prototype it, you look at the prototype of your API, you verify it with the stakeholders, and only then you commit to development. It's no longer code first, think later, okay? So this brings me to this role of a product owner. Wikipedia specification or definition of a product manager is that it's a person who owns the business strategy, specifies the product requirements, manages the launch, coordinates the work, and ultimately is responsible for the success of the product. There is a slight nuance between the product manager and product owner. Some of the books and materials think of a product owner as a more technical role, as somebody who is living with, for example, a Scrum team, working with the developers on a day-to-day basis. And the product manager, it's somebody more strategical, thinking about the strategy of the products. For the purpose of this talk, I think of a product owner, product manager as the same person. If you are in a large organization, you might want to split these two into a more strategical role and more tactical role being the product owner. Important thing is, an API product owner is a very technical role. A product owner must be able to, of course, make the calls with the APIs. It must be able to understand what the APIs is. It must be able to, the product owner must be able to understand the developer experience, the developer culture. But she or he needs to work with the business and be very business-oriented. I'm sure you know some scenarios where the product owner was absent and engineering were or is acting on behalf of the product owner. That usually leads to coding first, documentation. We engineers are really bad at documenting stuff, so we try to generate documentation from the code or not even that. And of course, engineers, we are shy people. We don't really talk to other people that much, so that's actually against the product ownership, where product owner needs to outreach to potential customers, talk to them, understand their needs. So there is a lot of pitfalls. There is one scenario where it is good to have an engineer as a product owner, and I will get to it in a second. My point is that the successful API products are driven by product market fit and not by technology. Whether it's REST API, GraphQL API, Kafka API, that's important, but it's not what's making the product successful. So going back to who acts as a product owner. If you are very serious with your API, you want to have a dedicated product owner. Meaning, if you have a public API or partners API, you definitely want to have dedicated product owner, or maybe this product manager, product owner combo. If we are going a little bit down with your APIs, if it's an organizational API, then maybe an architect, an enterprise architect, or domain architect can act as a product owner. And if you are talking to yourself, meaning you are the only consumer of the API you are building, let's say you are building a backend for front-end API, and you are going to consume it, then you are pretty much the only stakeholder. Then it's all right if you are the product owner of that API, even though we really suggest to treat all the APIs as potentially public APIs. OK, so finally, let's get to what the product owner is responsible for. I divide the areas of responsibility into 4 buckets: the foundation of a product, the implementation of a product, consumption, and evolution. They somehow relate to software development lifecycle, but I did not try to map it onto that because I think it makes more sense like this. So let's walk through these 4 buckets of responsibilities. First, the product foundation and strategy. If you are a product owner, you own the vision. You are responsible for the vision of the API product. You have to advocate and find the business case for the product. In other words, how is the API contributing to your business? You need to position your API on the product, on the market, find the product market fit. You, of course, have to understand and speak to the stakeholders of your API. So that means people in the company who are maybe putting some money on that, but also the customers or other interested parties. And as we talk about the landscapes of APIs, you need to position your API within the company or organizational landscape. So how does it fit to other APIs that you already have? It's no longer API standalone living in a silo. We suggest to use methodologies like hypothesis-driven product development and domain-driven design for vocabularies and domain identification. You, as a product owner, are also responsible for marketing, or at least you have to work with the marketing, set up the go-live strategy. How do you going to advertise your API? Where do you find its users? And of course, hold, maintain, and communicate the roadmap, goals, and objectives. But the last thing, probably most important one, and when engineers are acting as product owner, they don't realize that. But if you are a product owner, you are responsible for the budget of the product. You are responsible for the financials of the product. You need to advocate how much does it cost and what value the API is bringing. Moving next, specification of your product requirements. So here comes back to what I mentioned about the design first. The design first, API design, using open API specification, async API, GraphQL schema, whatever, is formalization, realization of your product requirements, functional requirements mostly. But you are also responsible for non-functional requirements, meaning that, how much is the API going to be used? What are the quota? What are the limits? Who are the users? What load are you expecting? These non-functional requirements should be also part of you thinking about the API product. You, together with an architect, should pick the appropriate architectural style. I'll be talking about it on a different conference later this year, how to pick the right one. Again, the important message here is you don't pick the architectural style and then you do the product. You pick the architectural style, REST, GraphQL, based on the needs of the product and based on the audience of the product. And you are also responsible for setting the evolution strategy for your API and maintaining the consistency with your existing landscape. Moving to the next area, tactics and development. So this is when you act as this product owner, when you are down there with the team, working with the team, owning the backlog, making sure the issues and the backlog items are clearly communicated and articulated to the team, and making sure they understand what they need to work and what is the next thing they are working on. Next, deployment and publishing. Product owner also has to be there when an API is published or being published, meaning you need to work with engineering and operations, set up the rate limits, decide on the geographical availabilities, decide on deployment zones and deployment environments, but also setting up an API management policies or products, meaning some packages that you sell, setting up the monetization, making sure the monitoring and analytics is set properly according to what your product needs. And last but not least, of course, monetization metrics and authorization and identity management. On the consuming side, documentation, of course. You are the one to take the hard job of documenting the API properly. You might, of course, have technical writers to help you with that. There is a lot of materials, a lot of talks about what API documentation should and should not be, so I'm not going to go into details. 2 points here I want to point out, though. Vocabulary, your domain. Make sure you communicate your domain, what things mean, because it might be clear to you, it might be clear within your company, it might not be so clear to others. And of course, communicate and document these non-functional requirements, rate limits, SLAs. Okay, developer experience and support. Previous talk had a really nice summary of how to get the feedback. That's the important part. But before getting the feedback, before setting up the support, you also might want to think about the developer experience beyond just the documentation, providing more than that, interactive documentation, SDKs, mockups for quick prototyping and whatnot. And then, of course, be clear about how your API is supported. At least have a contact points there, have availability, set the expectation right about the support. It's nothing like you email or send a message to your support and you don't hear them from 4 to 2 days. If that is the case, and it might be the case, at least make sure that everybody understands that there is such a big response time from the support. Finally, marketing, evangelism. I already mentioned this. So you work with a marketing team and maybe also have an evangelist, both internal or external, depending on the nature of API, to sort of preach your API, to get the users, to find people who might be interested in using the APIs. You might do outreach on the conferences and meetup to talk about that. More importantly, customer success. If you are a product owner, and that's also one thing that engineers tend to skip if they act as a product owner, you want to work with the sales, you want to work with the business, you want to be on the sales calls, just because you understand what people want, what is being actually sold to them, and that thing is, of course, your product. So it's a pre-sales or sales, if you will, and the after-sales, customer success. So when somebody already paid for your product or product related to your API, you want to understand how they are using it. You want to make sure that they are successful with your product, or at least learn from them, as we heard in the previous talk. All right, reporting. That's, of course, often overlooked. People maybe set it up, but they never look at the numbers. If you are a product owner, you need to understand how your API is being used for 2 reasons. To reflect it back to your product design, but also to understand the impacts of technical problems, the numbers of errors, and what may be hidden there is that what the customers and consumers want to do, but they are not getting it through your API. But again, going back to financials, you need to understand the impact of your API product on your business. How much does it cost, and how much does it make, directly or indirectly? Final point, updating and iterations. It was already mentioned here that the software development is, of course, an iterative process. You go in cycles. So you learn from the feedback, you update your API product, and you just go basically again and again until you start declining and until you eventually phase out your product. Okay. One thing that you also want to do during that is keep the alignment with the business. As you create an API product and launch it, you still want to make sure that the product, even a few years later, is aligned with what your business wants to do. And if not, you need to, even though it might be used product, you need to reconsider whether it makes sense to keep that product there if it's not contributing to what your current business objectives are. Just because it's popular, it might not make still sense to have that API there if it doesn't help your business to get where it needs to get. All right, so that's almost the end. The really message here is that I don't think there is such a thing as no product management. If you are having APIs, if you are having an APIs product, which I believe you do, then it is either a question of a good API management or bad API management. Thank you very much.
Anybody has any question for Zdenek? Okay.
Excellent talk. Thank you very much. So what are the typical design issues that you come across? What are the typical design issues, problems or mistakes that you come across?
So there are many areas where I can start to think of about that. The question is, what are the typical design issues? So one is very technical, how I design something using REST or GraphQL or Kafka. That I put aside. I think the most fundamental problem with APIs as a product is not thinking enough about the users. It's not, even before getting down into REST or GraphQL, it's really, I don't know who the user exactly is. I'm just going to, I have this, actually, I call this like inside out. You look inside the company, what you have, and you create an API for that. That's the inside out approach, and I think that's the wrong one. You really need to think about outside in. So what the market wants, what the potential consumers and customers want. Of course, you need to align that with the business, and then project it back in your design onto what the API and what the design should be. Not the other way around. Hey, let's do some APIs for the APIs. That's really what I'm seeing quite often, that companies are building APIs just because they can, or they are just modernizing web services to REST or whatever, just because they think they should do it, but they not really think about the consumers outside. So I would say the fundamental is really understanding the use cases and customers. Thank you.
Yeah, we can make it.
Hey, excellent talk. And 2 questions. One is very simple. Where can I get the slides? Because I've been taking pictures of each of those. And
yeah, it's a lot of slides. I post all my slides on the slide sharing.
Speaker deck? Yeah.
Brilliant. Okay, thank you. The other one is, when talking about APIs, the thing that most of people think probably is, HTTP, REST, maybe some people think GraphQL, but APIs is more than that. Like, for example, languages has their APIs. And do you think outside of the usual suspect, is there a market for applying these types of management and methodologies in different types of APIs beyond the usual?
I think yes. Like the answer is yes. You, as a product owner and architect, working with the product owner, you need to understand what are the integrational points. So, and I think Alan mentioned it earlier this morning, that there are companies are still sending the files. So you need to understand that this is still a possibility. And I must warn you that sometimes sending a file is actually the right way to do. We have a story from Adidas where we were evangelizing APIs so much that the HR team came and said, hey, we want to build an API. And they designed a very nice API. And then I came 2 weeks later and asked them, like, OK, what's the use case? Who are the customers of this API? It turns out that the use case they had, it didn't make sense to have a very nice hypermedia REST design API. It really was the situation where sending a big, fat file somewhere and let them process it is actually a good way to do. So, because we know APIs, don't think about everything like, everything looks like a nail if you have a hammer, right? So yeah, think about also other integration methods. It's not just about runtime APIs.
Okay,